Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Dr. Michael Hudson. He's the author of Super Imperialism, which is about to be available once again in its third edition, coming out at the end of the month. Dr. Michael Hudson, welcome back.
It's good to be back, Max.
All righty. So the book is called Super Imperialism, The Origin and Fundamentals of U.S. World Dominance. When did you first publish it, and what's the main thesis?
I published it in September of 1972. Just 13 months after the United States went off gold. And at that time, people were wringing their hands and saying, oh, now that the U.S. has lost gold, it's lost its ability to control other countries. And I pointed out that once countries and central banks didn't have gold anymore to cash in the U.S. balance of payments deficit, which was entirely military, there was nothing they could do to save foreign reserves but buy U.S. Treasury securities. And my argument was that replacing gold with U.S. Treasury securities meant that other countries kept their international reserves by financing the U.S. military balance of payments deficit. Because all throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s, the entire U.S. balance of payments deficit was a result of the war in Southeast Asia and elsewhere around the world. The private sector was exactly in balance. So when people talked about the dollar glut, this was the dollar glut coming out from military spending abroad. Well, I wrote the book thinking that, well, this will create be supported by socialists and the left to de-dollarize and resist the dollars. But immediately upon publishing the book, within a month, Herman Kahn asked me to join the Hudson Institute, and the Defense Department gave the Institute an $85,000 grant, much more than I got for the book, for me to explain to them how imperialism worked. And Herman Kahn said that I'd explained how American monetary imperialism was running rings around British colonial imperialism and was the biggest ripoff in history. And instead of the book being spurring a reaction of foreign countries not to accept the dollars, it became a how to do it book for the Defense Department, the CIA. I was brought up to the White House to meet with the Treasury secretaries, President, everybody, and they said, gee, now that we're off gold, who would have thought that leaving no alternative to gold forces other countries to buy U.S. dollars with all of the dollar inflows. So the more we spend abroad, whether on military spending or to buy up their industry, all this money's recycled. And actually, it's the balance of payments deficit that's financing the domestic budget deficit as foreign countries buy U.S. Treasury securities because they don't buy corporate stocks and corporate bonds, at least not at that time. So this was an explanation of how the U.S. used the International Monetary Fund to control and impoverish other countries and make debtor countries dependent on U.S. foreign policy. It showed how the World Bank fought against other countries becoming independent in their own food and had to rely on U.S. agriculture. It showed how U.S. control of the World Trade Organization was designed to break into foreign markets. And especially it traced how the United States had essentially set out during World War II to destroy England as a rival imperialist power and had taken over the British Empire by basically using debt leverage over it, like it later used debt leverage against third world countries.
We just heard reports recently that the U.S., upon evacuating Kabul, left behind $85 billion worth of U.S. taxpayer weapons. Put this into context for us, because it sounds like what you're talking about here. Since 1971, when America went off the gold standard, you wrote your book, Super Imperialism, in 1972. You're talking about foreign exchange rates and its relation to the military. And okay, so it seems to me that this is a good example of what you're talking about. So being on a dollar standard, as we have been now since 1971, a fiat money standard, I should say, not gold-backed, allows America to do stuff like just shower money all over the world because they just print it, right? And that it has no accountability and it's just printing money, number one. And number two, the wars in these foreign territories, you mentioned Southeast Asia, which of course is Vietnam, and what we're seeing in the Mideast, and America's empire. It's one where to maintain the trade, we have to maintain a trade imbalance, right? As Stacey is always saying, to keep the dollar as world reserve currency. So you're suggesting, of course, that this is why we have so many wars and so many military bases. So is it too far to say that the U.S. dollar is all based on war since 1971 for sure?
Well, the U.S. trade balance is not anywhere near as bad as it's reported. For instance, when we import oil, that looks as if it's a big problem in the trade balance, but hardly any of the money we pay for oil is actually paid to foreign countries. Only 10% of what America pays for oil ends up being paid abroad because it's paid, all of the oil is imported from American oil companies. And this money that we pay the oil companies really never leaves this country. It's profits, it's rent, it's machinery that we use to produce the oil. So the trade balance and the investment balance isn't really a problem. Almost the entire problem with the American balance of payments, like the budget deficit, is military spending. Well, regarding your question about Afghanistan, that was supposed to have cost $2 trillion. Hardly any of this was given to Afghanistan. It was all spent in the United States. So basically, the cause of all of that is the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex basically operates on a cost-plus basis. In other words, it maximizes the cost of the weapons it produces, like the F-35, and gets the markup on how much it's able to spend. So the military-industrial complex basically told the government two things. We need to make our profits and employ labor by building these weapons. You have a choice. You can either drop them into the Pacific Ocean, or you can drop them into Afghanistan. So we dropped the weapons into Afghanistan. And as far as the military is concerned, okay, we've already spent the money on the weapons. We've given the profits to Raytheon and Boeing and the other companies, U.S. companies. So it doesn't matter what happens to them. So they've left them in Afghanistan, and who knows what Afghanistan's going to use them for. It certainly is not going to use the airplanes or helicopters to attack the United States. The U.S. doesn't care. All it cared is that it paid the campaign contributors, the military, for these weapons, and it's sort of a circular flow between the U.S. government and the military producers and all of this, and to the contractors and to all of the generals who got rich off all of this.
So you make the point that 90% of that $2.2 trillion for the Afghanistan war stayed essentially in the U.S. And so the money is printed and it's basically gifted to the military industrial complex, the defense contractors, et cetera. And but what's interesting, though, is Dr. Michael Hudson, is that we see the exact same thing happening with the banks and their relationship to the government in terms of the money they're supposed to be distributing for programs like food stamps and other transfer payments. 90% of it stays at the banks. It doesn't actually reach the people that it says they're supposed to reach. So here you have two sectors of the economy, military and banks, which are probably, by extension, you'd have to say that would be more than 50% of GDP. It's probably closer to 75% of the entire GDP of the United States is based on two major industries that are engaged in this fraud of inducing the government to print money and then keeping it. And they use it. I guess the propaganda is they're going to free the people of Afghanistan by keeping 90 cents of every dollar they print. And they're going to help the poor people in America by keeping 90 cents of every dollar they print. So is that about right?
Yes. The prime directive of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury is that the banks and the 1% cannot lose any money. And so they're worried right now because of the COVID crisis. So they've said, we're going to give an enormous amount of money to renters and to mortgage borrowers so that they don't get evicted. Well, they give the money to the renters to pay the landlords, so the landlords can pay the banks on the mortgages that they've taken out to buy the property. And essentially, it's a circular flow by way of the renters and by way of the families that have borrowed to take out a mortgage and buy a home but can't pay because of the COVID. All this money that's being given to help homeowners and renters is paid, all ends up getting paid right to the bank. So the renters and the homeowners are simply intermediaries for the Federal Reserve to transfer money to the banks to make sure that the banks don't lose any money on the mortgage loans, which take up about 80% of bank lending in the United States.
All right, I want to talk about your book, Super Imperialism, and now it's coming out in the third edition soon. It's a classic, but it's a great book. So you write, quote, in 1949, the United States held 3/4 of the world's gold. By 1960, it had become a debtor nation. And yet, the United States has built history's most powerful and affluent empire. Okay, how did they do that?
That's exactly the point. How is it that the United States can rule as a creditor against third world countries that owe American bondholders and yet control Europe and other countries by being a debtor? It controls them by saying, well, all of your foreign reserves are now held in the United States. For instance, Venezuela held U.S. gold in the United States and reserves. The United States simply grabbed it. And it's doing the same with Afghanistan. Afghanistan had almost $1 trillion in reserves. The United States said, well, we don't like you, so we're going to grab all of your reserves, and now you can't have it. And the United States can tell other countries, it can tell Europe, Japan, China, other countries, any holdings you have that go through the U.S. banking system, we can grab anytime. And we can grab it through your SWIFT settlement system. And that's finally leading China, Russia, Iran, and other countries to de-dollarize. They say, now that we used to hold our money in dollars because they were as good as gold, but now they're not as good as gold. And so China, Russia, and other countries instead are buying gold and keeping it at home, not like Venezuela did and keep it in the Bank of England that grabbed it and gave it to the Americans. They're keeping it their way. And so you're seeing the world fracturing between a dollar area and a de-dollarized area. The dollar area will be shrinking. The United States set up Europe so that Europe cannot run a budget deficit, Keynesian style. So without running a budget deficit, there aren't euro securities for people to buy.
Pick up where we left it off, of course, is classic. Super Imperialism, first published in 1972, is about to come out in its third edition. Looking forward to that. You've got another new book, Michael, The Destiny of Civilization. What's that all about?
Well, basically, it's about how economies work and how what people thought was industrial capitalism has turned into something quite different. Finance capitalism, that instead of expanding like industrial capitalism does with more and more technology and more capital investment, raising productivity, raising wages, and a positive feedback, financial capitalism is just the opposite. It's cannibalized industrial capitalism. And instead of creating products that people use, it creates debt and monopoly rights. So under the finance capitalism that the United States and Europe have today, more and more of American income, it has to be spent not on goods and services, but on rent or on mortgage interest that can absorb up to 43% of the borrower's income with government guaranteed. 18% of the U.S. GDP is medical care for the medical insurance. About 10% is taken off the top for the Social Security and FICA wage withholding. And basically, 7% of American GDP is a completely fictitious financial category called homeowners' imputed rent. And it's the rent that if homeowners had to rent their homes to themselves, how much would they charge? And of course, since rents went up 20% last year, homeowners would charge much more money to themselves for rent, even though no payment occurs. And so GDP appears to be going up. But when you take out the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the FIRE sector is actually gone down. So my book describes how the FIRE sector is the antithesis of industrial capitalism. It's everything that the classical economists of the 19th century and earlier 20th century wanted to do away with. Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and the others wanted to get rid of land rent and monopoly rent and financial rent. And to them, a free market was a market that was free of all of this unearned income and rent. But under finance capitalism, it's all about unearned income, as you've talked about on your show often enough. It's all about creating debt and extracting interest and capital gains and income that has nothing to do with creating goods and services for people. So I was asked to write a series of lectures to serve as a textbook for Chinese so that they wouldn't have to be sent to America to study economics in the economics departments and universities, which really isn't about how economies work. It's about how textbooks work in a kind of parallel universe, as if everybody were getting rich off industrial capitalism instead of looking at debt and the FIRE sector and what actually happens under finance capitalism. And the intention is to show Chinese what to avoid, how to avoid the American trap that is shrinking the American economy and loading it down with debt, so that China can prevent this kind of monopoly capitalism, prevent finance capitalism, prevent debt-financed housing prices going up, and create a socialist economy. So it shows that the destiny of industrial capitalism was really socialism, supposed to be socialism, but it ended up in finance capitalism, and the world is breaking into two parts. The U.S. dollar sector, which is finance capitalist, and China, Russia, and the de-dollarizing economies that are trying to focus on industrialization and raising their own living standards.
I should mention, as people hear a siren in the background, you, of course, are in New York, and that's a classic New York sound in the background. So thanks for that little ambiance. All right, let's talk about, so China, of course, is launching the Belt and Road Initiative, which is sounds like what you would describe as goods and services, goods capitalism, as opposed to pure finance capitalism. And give us an idea of where we are with U.S. and China, because the dynamic there and what looks to be a classic Thucydides trap, where you've got potentially China rising up as the new dominant world economic power and the U.S. Taking a back seat. Is that actually happening? And where are we in that cycle? Where are we with China right now in the U.S.?
The idea of a Thucydides trap is a trivialization. The people who describe a Thucydides trap talk as if the U.S. is an industrial rival of China, and we're both playing the same game, and somebody's going to win this game of who can export more and grow more. That's not what's occurring at all, and it's not what occurred between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides completely destroyed the American idea of the Thucydides trap. He made it very clear that the fight between Athens and Sparta was between a democracy, Athens, and oligarchy, Sparta. There was a conflict of economic systems. It wasn't a rivalry to see who could export more, because the Spartans didn't produce exports. They were military countries. They conquered countries and supported oligarchies. Well, that's the same. What America is, you could say, is like Athens and Sparta. You have America is the oligarchy, supporting oligarchies abroad and fighting against democracy, whether it's a democracy in Venezuela or China or Cuba or Russia, and it's installing dictators. It supports people that it calls democracy, but it turns out to be Pinochet in Chile. It turns out to be the Latin American dictators. It turns out to be the Honduran dictators that Hillary Clinton overthrew. So the fight is between America promoting this finance capital idea that other countries have to sell their industry to American buyers, that it has to let Americans buy control of their industry so that other countries are turned into a kind of financial colony of the United States, as the United States has managed to do with Latin America and some other countries. And against that are countries wanting to become self-sufficient, independent, produce their own food, rely on their own technology, and keep the economic a surplus that they create at home to recycle, as industrial countries are supposed to do. So the fight between China and America is a conflict between economic systems, not for exports. After all, the United States doesn't want to export industrial goods. It wanted to import industry from cheap labor in China. So when people talk about the Thucydides trap, they're trying to just whip it up in a nationalistic form of saying it's us versus them, without saying who is the us, and what's America trying to promote, and who is the them, and what kind of society are they trying to promote.
Yeah, good point. We've been using this Thucydides trap as an analogy now for quite some time, and you are putting it into context, given your extensive writing on these topics for decades. It's highly appreciative. Now, let's put this into context with what's happening in China. So you did a series of lectures. They wanted to know about how to avoid what I guess they perceived in the United States as being an over-reliance on the financial sector, which put the U.S. at a disadvantage in so many ways. So where do you think China is in the global economy now in relation to the U.S.? How would you describe China right now?
It's trying to avoid having an oligarchy getting rich by controlling monopolies and controlling the banks.
All right, stop right there. So in other words, when we hear news like they're cracking down on these big tech companies, they're cracking down on various companies from going public, they're taking over Alibaba, right? So that's what's going on. They're breaking up the oligopolies, and they're bringing them where? Under more state control?
They're regulating, not really under state control at all, because they rejected state control. What they want to do is prevent monopolies from getting economic rent that enable the leaders to lord it over the rest of the population. They can say, Alibaba, we want you to be as successful as you can, but we're going to limit the amount of money that you can get, and we're not going to let you diversify into creating credit and to becoming a quasi-bank.
All right, let me ask you this. Let me jump in here, since you're such a historian. A lot of people say, you know what? Going back 500 years, I believe, to the Ming Dynasty, Chinese burnt down their fleet. They had a huge naval fleet all over the world. The new guy came in and he burnt it to the ground. The theory was that he didn't want the competition from merchants interfering with what he had to do. Is this a similar moment?
Yes, it is. Except today, the problem isn't merchants and trade, because the trade is sponsored basically by the government. The concern is the creation of domestic monopolists, and all the monopolists were being subsidized and supported by the United States. The United States went to China and said, a free market is letting a few rich people become kleptocrats and privatize public wealth and become billionaires, and to create monopolies that'll be billionaires, and create companies that we Americans can invest in and buy in, and we can get rich off your stock market that is created by an oligarchy that you will create, so that we end up with the money, and your oligarchs, our pet oligarchs, are also becoming billionaires, instead of the Chinese people getting rich. Let's all get together with the billionaires of the world and run the world by creating our own monopolies and our banks, and we can reduce the rest of the world to feudalism.
All right. Next question. So what's China going to do with all the dollars they have? They've got over $1 trillion. They've got $3 trillion, I believe, in their reserves. Do they dump them on the market? Do they keep accumulating them? What's the strategy there?
They've been reducing their dollar reserves steadily and buying gold, and they need reserves in order to stabilize the value of the exchange rate between the yen and the U.S. dollar. So they need these reserves in order to prevent the United States from trying to crush the currency and doing to China what it did to Syria and other countries that don't follow American directives. So the reserves are its protection, financial protection, basically.
Do you have a call on Taiwan? Is there going to be some action there?
I don't really think so, because most Taiwanese want to invest in China. The question is the terms on which they will be allowed to invest in China and the reciprocity that the two countries are trying to develop together right now.
All right. That's it, Dr. Michael Hudson. If I ever play the game of Risk, which is a board game for world domination, I want you on my team. But we're going to take over the world, I think, next time I play Risk. Thanks for being on Kaiser Report.
It's really good to be here, man.